Subscribe, please.
Hey guys, welcome back. It's your favorite Gimp with a Limp, and I am here with something quite massive, quite interesting, quite awesome for you. This is Thunder in the East by Frank Chadwick. They always make sure and say that. Frank Chadwick's Thunder in the East. Let me grab it right there on the top of it. This is actually a Kickstarter that just released, and the cool part is they're planning on expanding this. You see it says Volume 1 there at the top. So they're going to take and continue this game on. I think they're planning on doing like the Mediterranean next, and then maybe Europe for the third edition. But supposedly you'll be able to like lay out all the maps and have them all connected if you want, and have a massive game, which I don't even understand how someone could try to do that, because this set of maps here alone is taking up so much space. And then with all the player aids that I'm going to show you guys here in a sec, I mean, that's just massive, the amount of stuff that comes with it. It's over 1,000 counters, multiple sets of different types of dice, and then all the informational counters, some of which are optional. When it comes to game, there's just so much to it. I'm actually going to back the camera up for a second, let you guys kind of see the whole setup that I've got going on here. I mean, this is a 4 by 6 foot table. Basically, I've got set up here, and you can see how much this is taken up. It's just a massive amount of game. Actually, I think it's a 5 by 6. But it's just a lot. You guys can see it. The player aids are there on the right. I'm going to take and focus in on some of that specifically here in a sec. Now, you will notice that I do have the plexiglass set across the maps. Normally, I do try to avoid using the plexiglass just to avoid the reflections that you guys are seeing here in the corner from my lights. Unfortunately, I can't do that with this one just because it is so big. I can't afford to risk having the maps slide along as the game plays, because this one is going to be on the table for a while to get through just the Barbarossa scenario of it. So what I'm going to do is, as I take and focus in, I'll zoom in on specific parts when we're dealing with certain parts of the game, and I'll move the lights around so you guys won't have the reflection to deal with during that. But when we're backed out like this, you're just going to have to accept the reflection. I need to have that plexiglass down so it keeps the map stable. One thing that I did notice is you'll see that this far right map, because there's 4 sections to it. There's this top section up here, bottom section. These are both the same size, and then there are 2 half-size maps, one up here and then one down here. And this one on the bottom right is actually a little bit brighter. You can see it stands out from the rest of it. You can easily see where it is. That I actually contacted them about it, and they've already taken care of it. They're going to get that fixed up for me. So good job, Victory Point Games. They're taking care of it for me. I do appreciate that. And I'm trying to think, like, where do I start with this? This is just a setup video. This is just kind of an eyeball of the land. All right, we're going to get started in part 1 with the whole shebang, really kicking off with the game. Let me show you one thing that I really do like that they did with the rulebook, because they weren't originally going to do this, right? Let me turn to the specific page and show you guys what I am talking about. Here it is. In the bottom right of the rulebook, you see where it has color coding for the different types of things that you're going to read in the rulebook. Like blue, anything that you read in blue, you knew had to deal with the air power. If it was italics, you knew it happened during your opponent's turn. If it was yellow, it's a optional rule. And if it's brown or orange, whatever that color is, it's a campaign rule. Now, for my first playthrough of this game, I'm just doing the basic rules. I'm not even incorporating the optional rules, which are the yellow rules, and I'm not incorporating the campaign rules because the game is just so massive. There's so much going on with it. I want to focus on the core experience for the start of it. And then just depending on how the playthrough goes and what kind of response I get, if there's a big response to see some of the campaign or some of the optional rules, we'll take and explore that at this point. But there is so much game just involved with the core rules itself. And I like how the rulebook is divided out, because once you read to page 60, the rulebook itself is 88 pages. Once you read to page 60, you have the basics of the game down, and then you get into the optional rules, which is the next section, and then the campaign rules, which again is the brown, and it's color-coded all the way throughout the rulebook, and it's color-coded in the player aids themselves. You guys can see, I mean, this is the turn sequence. You can see how massive this thing is. Even this is color coded, so you know, okay, well, this is campaign. So if we're doing a season start phase, which is very specific to the campaign game itself, this is brown. I know that. Okay, this close air support, of course, that's going to be air. Air transport, that's an optional rule. Naval, what is that? Naval strike, that's an optional rule. So if you're not using the optional rules, you know, you can ignore the yellow sections or the orange sections, you know, just depending on what you're doing. And then when you're going down through your actual phases themselves, you know, okay, when I hit this, this has to do with my air units. This is something I don't have to worry about, and then so on throughout reading it. So they did an excellent job when it came to the player aids themselves, having all that color coded for you. Backside of this is the morale chart. This is, as you can see from the color, part of the campaign. We're not going to be using that for our playthrough. Let me take and show you guys a couple of other little playthroughs or player aids. We've got our Thunder in the East build cost chart, and there's a lot of different little points that you have to worry about. Personnel points, equipment points, fuel points, offensive points, morale points. There's a lot of different points. So it can get kind of heavy, but I think with a game of this nature, the type it is, it's, you know, like a mini monster. I think it's a monster. From the debate, I've seen people saying they think it's a mini monster, but they've done it as well as can be expected for the volume that you're dealing with. So this, you can see where you can take and buy or upgrade your small, medium, and large units, which are called majors and minors in this game. We'll get into that more specifically. But understand, if I say a minor unit, that means one of the small counters. And if it's a major unit, it's a medium or a large counter. You can also take and upgrade or repair your air units. And the backside of this is going to be our terrain effects chart. Just like anything else, it might affect movement cost and it might have combat effects. So we'll have to take and make sure we keep track of that. One neat part about this is they do have railroads in the game, obviously, but there's rail points. There's a special movement phase in this game, like your strategic movement phase is a way to kind of think about it. And depending on how many rail movement points you have allotted, that's another point system you keep track of, is how much rail movement you can actually do on the board. So that's just another neat little aspect that I think was cool that they added into the game. We also have our standard combat table. We'll take and get into this very specifically into the game, but you guys can see it is D6 based. And that's one of the things that I was like, no, come on, do something else. Me personally, and this is just my personal opinion, I think too many people use the D6. I would like to see more D10s or at least a 2D6 system, you know, something to give it just a little more variety than just the standard D6. And again, that's not me knocking on the game. That's not saying, you know, the game's horrible. The combat odds table is excellent. I think this is very well done. I just like having more results for, you know, my dice, like a D10, D12, D8. Just too many people use D6, you know, have a different size. Down below, it takes and lists down all the different effects. Very nice. Backside, we've got our dogfight table because we do have dogfights. So all our air missions that can be done in the game, of which there's actually a lot. And airplanes in this game are abstracted. They're not done kind of like Unconditional Surrender did, where the planes were kept on the board but still abstracted in a fashion. All your planes are going to be kept off board. I'll show you those player aids here in just a second. And they have to do with adding their dice. That's these custom dice here, which I really like this system. It's a little confusing at first, but basically the planes can add or subtract or, you know, adjust odd shifts in your favor or versus your opponent during your ground combat. And then they can take and have combat with other planes, you know, dogfights, just depending. And whoever wins is the one that actually gets the dice, helping their combat, their ground combat go on. So just neat system we'll take and get involved with. These dice are used in some other occasions, but the basic gist is you're going to be using these for your air combat. And just to show you guys, it does come with a couple of D6s of each color, you know, black for Germans, red for Soviets. So that takes care of our player aids that we need to worry about on for the game itself, I'm going to take and pan over real quick and show you all the player aids I have set up to keep track of the game itself. Okay, I've got it zoomed in back here because there are just so many player aids. I'll pan it down, you guys will see what I'm talking about. And since the game takes up so much room, I've just got them tucked over here to the side to be out of the way, and I'll take and deal with those. This one here is our turn record track. We'll get into that more specifically when we really get into the game. But I do like how they have it set up to where the game's keeping track of your seasons and your weather and things like that. And basically your summer and spring are going to have more turns than autumn or winter. That's what these Roman numerals are running through the middle of the turn record track. You can see that winter, for the most part, is only going to have 2. I think occasionally it can have 3. But spring and summer are going to have 4 turns. And then autumn's only going to have 3 turns. And the weather is going to vary, which is selected down here at the bottom, depending on what season you're in. And then there along the top is the months. Again, sorry I am so far back from it. It just is a lot of stuff. Over here on our right, we do have our airplane board. I'm having a brain fart. Our air unit board where we're going to keep track of it. There are 3 sections to keep track of: available, flown, and destroyed. And the basic way to think about that is the farther up at the top of the player aid, the aircraft unit, the counter is, the sooner it's going to be available to conduct combat actions. They have multiple different ways they can be on the board. They can be ready and good to go where they're face up, or they can be damaged where they're face down. And then they can be damaged in the flown box or damaged in the destroyed box. Or they can be suppressed, which is something that can happen when you make your different attacks on certain areas. And basically it's just more steps down the board that you'll go that's going to take you longer and more resource points to get that aircraft available to use again. And also there is a special rule, which is this over here on the right with the red star, that does affect the Russian aircraft in the fact that they're not going to take and be available for use as quickly as the German aircraft are. The Russians do have a lot more available at start than the Germans do, but the Germans are going to be able to get theirs rolled through a hell of a lot quicker and back into the action. All right, let's pan down and I'll show you guys this big display map for each of the sides. Okay, so you guys can see I've got them laid out here, and I've actually set them up a little bit farther ahead than what it actually suggested. Like these units here along the top of the German map and part of the Russian map, it has dates listed down at the bottom of the units. Let's zoom in and let you guys see that a little bit. You guys can see it has dates listed down, and that's when certain units are going to become available. Now, depending on what scenario you're playing, you might not get down to these bottom areas, especially like the Barbarossa scenario is only going to last 13 turns, so you're not going to get all the way down here. I went ahead and put them out just so the counters were out of the way, but it is a real neat system. I like that. It accounts for the fact that, you know, Germany and Russia were making technological advancements and improving their equipment, and new units were coming online, and you're going to get access to those historically when they did become available. So this is arranged like this for both sides, but mainly for the Germans. They have kind of made exceptions for the Russians on the way they handle things versus the Germans. You can see right here is our point tracker, and this is where we're going to keep track of the personnel points, the equipment points, the fuel points, your rail usage, all that different stuff. Same stuff that you've kept track of before, basics right here. You're going to use this to take and get units from your force pool. Let's back out and let you see the force. Okay, so when you're looking down here, it looks like there's a lot going on, but it is kind of easy to understand once you get the gist of what all this means. Your force pool is basically your available units, what you can build, okay? Just think of it like that and you're good to go. Now, over here to the right, these are your change boxes, all right? And think of this like a cash register, right? But the cash register has to keep a certain level in it. You have to keep a certain amount of money in this cash register. So if you take something out, you're putting something else back in. And what it has to do with is that the units can break down or build up into stronger units. Like this one is a 4-step unit, which you can tell because of the 4 dots in the upper right corner. And you can combine a couple of different units to get this one. That's what these little icons are all across the bottom and on the sides here. It tells you what specific units you have to have in the same hex, and then there's a step during the game turn itself where you can take and combine those units into a bigger unit. Now, it is neat how they've done this, because for this unit, for example, this is a 24-16-5 unit. Basic gist, we'll get into these numbers more specifically when we start playing, but attack, defense, move. Okay, that's the way to think about it. Well, the 2 units you put together to make this is a 12-9-6 unit. All right, so you put together 2 12-9-6 units and you get this one. Well, you're getting a bigger unit that has a very strong attack, but because of its larger size, it's going to have a little bit reduced defense. So 9 plus 9 equals 18, but you don't get 18 on your defense, you get 16, because the unit is weakened a little bit by being grouped together and bunched up like that. Plus it moves just a little bit slower with only having a 5 movement instead of a 6 movement that the core units did have. And now this army unit has that. The reason you're going to do stuff like this is that there is a limitation to the amount of units you can attack with across a single hex side. So by building up your units, you can take and get a stronger attack going across a single hex side, because for a single hex side, you can only have 1 major unit, which again is 1 large or 1 medium counter. You can have a small unit with it. I won't get into all that. We'll get into that when we get into the game itself. But the basic gist is there is a tactical reason why you would take and build up a unit so it would have a stronger attack but a weaker defense. This is going to be a big thing for the Germans to do. I really like this system in the game. Now, it is a little bit of a pain in the butt, though, when it comes down to your units taking damage, because if you have army units that take damage and they incur a step loss, you could possibly be taking and switching out a army size large counter for some smaller core size counters, the medium counters, onto the board. And with a game of this size, with the unit structure that they're dealing with, it's really unavoidable. Me personally, for ease of reference, I prefer the ones where you just take and have one side is good, the other side is reduced, and then after that, it's off the board. But like I said, they're dealing with just so many different types of units and the different structures between the 2 different forces that had to be part of the game. But they have simplified it as much as could possibly be done with this change board that's on both sides. So you can easily see this is how the units break down or build up. These are their component parts. You also have what's called your core remnants box, which is what's over here. And if you have a core that takes damage and incurs a step loss, this is where you're going to get those smaller counters that can be used to represent what's left over, ergo the core remnants box, the remnants of them. You can see like that's a infantry division, or I think that's a Panzer Grenadier, isn't it? The one with the oval and the X through it. But you have the different types that are in here, the components. So when your cores do take that damage, you can break them down and replace them with these component parts. All right, let's pan over. I'll show you the Russian side. Okay, just really quickly, you can see the Russians are set up similar to how the Germans were set up, and the fact that certain units are going to become available during certain time periods. There are some other special considerations that comes into play. We'll get into those more specifically later on, but you guys can see I've got some of their excess army stacked up here, or their cores over there. They will be involved into the game at a later point. Here again in the center, they have their track where they're going to keep track of their points. Same thing, personnel points, equipment points, and rail points, all that other good stuff. The Russians do have a specific limiting factor, though, in the fact that they have to keep at a minimum 40 personnel points and not spend that. It's like a dictate from Stalin. So that's their minimum. Once they hit that, they can't spend below that point in the Barbarossa campaign. Okay, and also just like how the Germans had it set up to where they had a force pool that they can buy from, you can see just like in real life, the Russians had far more men, like just raw troops to choose from than the Germans did. So they automatically start with a whole lot more in their box. One of the other neat aspects of this game is some of them are hidden. That's what these little question marks are getting into. And they're not exposed until they're actually attacked in game. You guys will see how that works, but you actually have to flip the unit over to see what its actual stats are. So that's a neat little addition that they have going in the game. These are other things they can build. They actually have 3 of these Army HQ counters. These basically represent where your headquarters are and where your supply is coming from. Again, we'll get into that more specifically later. There are 2 different types of these counters. You can use these big round ones, or they do have smaller ones that look more like the Army units. Personally, I much prefer these because they stand out on the board very, very well. But if you don't want them to stand out on the board, they do have counters that kind of blend in a little bit better. Over to the right, we can see the Russian change box, just the same as how the Germans have it, building up or breaking down their units. But they also have a raised army unit organization in that they can take a specific type of counter, add a point to it, whether it's a personnel point, an equipment point, whichever, and then they'll get a different type of unit they can choose from, and then they can upgrade that later with more personnel points and get into these farther right, larger army units that they have over here. It's a different system to account for the way that the Russians set up their military versus how the Germans set up their military. Again, I like the system. It's a little bit complex, a little bit fiddly. You're dealing with a lot of counters that you're having to keep track of back and forth, especially if you're doing like me and playing this crap solitaire. So you got to keep track of both sides. But I think they've simplified it as much as possible under the given circumstances. So I do like the system. I like how it's laid out. They have the counters very well represented. They have little summaries of what you're doing, whether it's change or raised units, stuff like that. So I think they've streamlined this process as much as possible for the game. So I do like that. And again, they also have their core remnants box here, just like the Germans have a core remnants box. The Russians also have access to a partisans pool, which I don't have set up because you can see that I just have excess units stored there for now. The yellow box designates that as a optional rule, and I'm not doing the optional rules for this first playthrough, so I don't have those units set up. All right, let's pan back to the board and I'll show you a couple more things and then we'll get ready to start the game. Okay, I've just zoomed in on a random part of the map real quick just to show you guys a couple of things. Again, this is more of what you're probably going to see when I'm playing through the game because I'm going to try to take and move it around as much as possible to avoid any lighting issues when the game's playing. Just something else I wanted to point out that I like that they included, I think this was actually one of the stretch goals, was these supply dice, all right? And these aren't dice that you're going to roll. You can see I've got them laid out around the board, and what they're used for is just a visual cue of supply, all right? Because the way this game works is that each opponent determines each other's side. Basically, you keep each other honest is a way to think about it. But so the Russians are going to determine the German supply status and vice versa. This makes it easier when you're determining supply status because not only is it determined by line of communication, which is what you would standardly think of, draw a hex line from the unit to a point of supply, an ultimate source of supply, which is generally the edges of the board. But on top of that, on top of the line of communication, you've also got to be within a supply radius. So like this German command unit that's in its balanced mode, which again, we'll get into later, you can see at the bottom of it, it's got an 8 hex supply radius, okay? So that means for 8 hexes around that unit, that's where their supply comes from. So all units that are within 8 hexes that are going to be considered in supply. So I took and put a yellow dice there to signify that, and I've got those laid all around the map in different areas. Real innovative system. It makes it very easy to see at a glance where your supply is coming from for each different side. And it makes determining supply status a hell of a lot easier just because you're like, bam, there it is, big yellow dice stands out. The game itself, let me take and show you real quick in the scenario booklet. We'll pan out just a little bit. At the beginning, it goes over some of your different rules for each of the different scenarios. Like here, there's boundary lines on the board. And for Operation Barbarossa, the first one, it's using this big yellow border to determine where the actual borders are on the map. And you can see that's where I've actually got the units lined up. And it's because they have specific rules for lining up your frontline troops, your reserve troops, and then your command units and garrisons and all that stuff. We'll get into that a little more specifically, but the basic gist is you have to have your line covered. You can't take and focus all your troops. Like the German guy couldn't take and put all his troops right here in one big clump and then just push on straight through to Moscow. He has to cover the line and make sure everything's good to go. Then when you get into the actual scenario itself, it'll have a little operation blurb, you know, about whatever was going on historically. It shows you again what your starting line is, because they are going to have different starting lines. Some of them start back over, you know, farther back on if it was farther on during the war. Who your first player is, what game turn it starts with, how long it is, the initial weather, and then any special rules that are involved with it. Like this one, in addition to the other frontline unit setup restrictions, this also applies to Soviets. Large army-sized Soviet ground units cannot set up in adjacent hexes and must be be within 3 hexes of the setup line. So basically, the biggest 8-4 units couldn't take and set up adjacent to each other. They've got to be spaced out along the line. They too can't take and bunch up their guys and try to punch through and cut off the Germans. Little stuff like that to kind of keep it a little more historical. Other little special rules involved with it. Down over here, we go over our decisive victory versus or Axis versus Soviet decisive victories and all the different steps. Basically for this, it's who controls the most objectives. More than likely the Germans, because unless the dice gods just hate on them, the Germans are going to take and ruffle stomp the Russians for the first few turns, especially with that Blitzkrieg card. And it goes over the victory conditions. And I gotta say, for a game of this size, their setup chart, it kind of looked like Egyptian to me when I first eyeballed it before I had read the rulebook. But after I read the rulebook and kind of had an idea of what I was looking at and went through this, it's actually rather intuitive. I like how they include the type of unit it is, and if you want to go with historical accuracy, you can grab those specific units to take and place in, you know, here, the Northwest, West, Southwest, where all their different units were. I like how they had that there. And plus, that made it easier for me when I was setting this up to make sure I was actually grabbing the specific units I needed to, the right type of unit. With the number there, I could go, okay, I got these numbers of this type of unit. I know I've got the right ones. Got them all stacked up and then lined them up, so we were good to go. Again, they're sticking with their color coding. Your blue represents your air, and it tells you how they appear, like the available, ready to go, good to go aircraft. And then it tells you if you have any that start off, whether they're destroyed or damaged or anything like that. So that's actually really neat. And they actually have a few that start destroyed, damaged. So that means it's going to take them longer to enter the combat. Same thing with the others, your reserves. These are the ones that are a little bit farther back off the line. It tells you those. Your force pool, so what starts available to build for the Russian units. Their starting resource points, and then it again reinforces the fact that you can't spend more than, you have to keep at least 40 of those points available to use. and then it tells you what units to put in the change box. So really good system. Over here on the far side, it tells you what cards. We haven't even touched on the cards yet. We'll get into those here in just a sec. What cards you start with, if any of them are discarded or if any of them are out of the game, what you start with in your hand. Optional rules, campaign rules. They got this broke down very, very well. I gotta say, it is a well done scenario booklet, well done rule booklet. I'm very happy with it. Same thing for the Germans on how they're gonna set up their forces. Theirs are a little different. As you can see, they have Romanian and Hungarian forces they have to worry with. So when it came to setting up the forces, you can see I've got Hungary forces here and Romanian forces, which are the yellow ones, down here. I set up, on the board in Hungary, only what was in Hungary. Then in Romania, only what was in Romania. Romania actually has a few German units in it as well, just a couple small ones. But I had some extra German forces. I was like, man, I'd kind of like to spread them down a little bit, but I kept everything the way it's supposed to be historically. So we'll be punching over and pushing towards Moscow. Same thing, air display, what cards they start with. But when it comes to the Germans, they start with a very special card called Blitzkrieg. And Blitzkrieg itself actually has its own page of rules that are involved with just this single card. All right. There's like a page and a half of rules for the event cards and how they're going to be used in the game. But Blitzkrieg has its own page. It changes a whole lot of things. We're not going to go over that now, but when you're starting a scenario like you guys remember Blitzkrieg, Lightning Warfare, the Germans bust their way in and try to do a certain type of combat. This helps to simulate that and the effects that are done. It catches the Russians flat-footed. All German attacks are going to get an extra one of these, random dice that can give them extra shifts in combat. It helps them greatly. Basically, it makes that first turn very, very beneficial to the Germans. So you want to take and maximize that as much as possible. I think that's neat that they included that into the game because it's how do you simulate Blitzkrieg, the type of warfare that the Germans conducted in World War II, and simulate it accurately. Having it set up as a card that you can play as a one-off that will be used, and then you're not going to use that Blitzkrieg card again, but you'll have other cards that you can use. But it's very detrimental. It is very effective for that first turn, so you have to make the most of it that you can. I think that's a really good way to go with it. We'll get more into the cards themselves later on when we actually get into the game and we actually start playing some of those cards. But that's the basic gist of your setup. I do suggest going slow with it. Go with your historical setup just to make sure that you are grabbing the right pieces. There are so many you have to worry about. So many of the Russian ones have the question mark on them because you're not sure what they are. They're supposed to be hidden from actually both sides. I don't think even the Russian player is allowed to look at what's there. So you're kind of both surprised at what was in that location. So make sure you take and do that. I just think that's a little easier to help determine what you're doing. Once you've played the game a little bit and you've got your feet underneath you, if you want to do it historically, I don't think that's going to be an issue. But that's let me show you one other thing that they included that I do like. Let me grab a couple of these. These are some optional markers they included that are odds markers that you can lay down. Because when you declare an attack during your game, you have to take and declare all of your attacks. You can take and set down these markers denoting where the actual attack is going to take place. Let's zoom in. So let's say, these guys wanted to attack across. You would just take and figure out what your odds are, and you can go ahead and lay down that marker denoting, hey, that's where they're going to be attacking. And that way, any air forces you lay down next to it, stuff like that, easy to keep track of. Not something that they had to include, but something that is nice that they included. And there's a lot of different informational markers like that in the game that makes it easy for just keeping track of it, which I got to say I appreciate because the volume of this game, again, it's just so much to keep track of, especially if you are playing both sides. All right, but that's the basic gist. I know I've been talking for like 40 minutes without actually playing the game, but I kind of wanted to just give you a brief little taste of it. We're going to start off with turn one. blitzkrieg, lightning warfare, Germans attacking across. Again, they're shooting for Moscow, which is way over there. That's Moscow right there. So the Germans are going to be pushing on that, trying to take and cut off and surround the Russian forces. And the Russian forces are just going to try to hold them back as long as possible. Due to the nature of this game and the sheer size of it, I'm probably not going to be able to film a whole turn per video, just because the videos would get like 2 hours long if I did all of the Germans and then all of the Russians attacks. Hell, that'd probably be like 3 hours long. So my goal is to complete at least all of one phase. So, or one side's phases, hopefully. So German logistics, and then special movement, and then combat, and then regular movement, which is the neat thing. One other little thing I'll mention real quick about the game. You're going to see it a lot when we get started in turn one. They have the game set up as a move, combat, move system, but your special movement is first. And depending on how the situation is, your infantry might be able to move just a little bit during your special move, but your mechanized and tank units, they're going to be able to move a lot farther and a lot faster during that special move. And that helps represent the fact that infantry are slow. If they're on foot, they're not going to get very far. So you have to take and kind of get your infantry where they need to be to attack on the previous turn. And that's really going to bite the Russians in the butt, because they don't have a whole lot of mechanized units, but the Germans do. So the Germans are going to be able to kind of cut around them a lot quicker and a lot easier. And there's a whole lot of that involved with zones of control too, which we'll get into later. But I really like that move, combat, move system. Everyone can move in just the regular movement phase, but in the special movement phase, it's only going to be your faster units moving, and the slower ones might not move at all, or might only move just a little bit. So you have to be thinking a turn ahead at least on where you want someone to be to get that combat. And you might not be able to pin down that panzer unit because they'll be able to sneak around you in the special move phase, and then you're out of luck. Real neat system. You guys will see that here in a little bit. But again, I'll try to take and get as much of one segment, one phase in one video as I can, so it's not broken up too much. We'll just see how long it takes to film each one of the individual segments. All right, but that's going to be it for me. You guys stay tuned. I will have part one of this up as soon as possible. You guys take care. I'll catch you in the next one.